My name is Daniel Reyes, and I was 32 years old the year it happened. It was the summer of 2017, and I had taken some time off work in late August to go hiking in the northern part of Colorado. I had always been the kind of person who looked for quiet places far away from towns and busy campgrounds. Most of my coworkers and friends thought I was crazy for going out into the wilderness alone, but I always told myself that if I was careful, stuck to maps, and respected the land, I would be fine. That year, I had read about an old trail in the Roosevelt National Forest, a trail that wasn't really used much anymore. From what I could gather online, parts of it were overgrown and hard to follow, but it supposedly cut through a beautiful stretch of forest and climbed up toward some old fire lookout ruins on a ridge. It was marked on a few older maps, but newer ones didn't even show it. That made me curious. I liked exploring places most people didn't bother with. I packed my usual gear: a 40-liter backpack with my tent, sleeping bag, a small stove, 2 days worth of food, a water filter, extra socks, first aid kit, bear spray, a map, compass, and a GPS device. I carried a folding knife clipped to my pocket, and I wore my sturdy boots that had taken me over dozens of trails in the past few years. I figured I would hike in on this forgotten trail, find a place to camp for the night, and then come back out the next day. I parked my car at a pull-off along a forest road that morning. It was cool and quiet when I stepped out. The sun was just starting to burn off the fog that clung low to the ground. I shouldered my pack, locked the car, and started toward the trailhead. The first stretch was easy. The trail was narrow, but you could still see where people had walked at one time. The dirt was compacted, and old blazes, faded patches of paint, still marked some of the trees. It was clear that nobody maintained it anymore, but it was still there. After about an hour, the trail grew harder to follow. Grass and shrubs crept across it. Fallen branches blocked parts of it. I found myself stepping over logs and pushing aside brush. I kept checking my compass and GPS, making sure I was still moving in the right direction. By midday, I had gone several miles in. The forest grew thicker, darker. The air smelled damp, like moss and old leaves. I saw no one. I heard nothing except birds and the occasional rustle of something small moving through the undergrowth. That was exactly what I had wanted. Quiet, seclusion, a break from the world. But the deeper I went, the more I started to notice how different it felt from the well-used trails I was used to. Usually, on marked trails, you see signs of other people. Boot prints, bits of litter, cut logs from trail crews. Out here, there was nothing like that. It was just me, the trees, and a faint path that seemed to fade a little more with every 100 yards. I kept pushing forward, determined to reach the ridge before evening. By late afternoon, the atmosphere had shifted. The light slanted through the trees in long strips, making the forest floor darker between them. I was sweating heavily, and my shirt stuck to my back. My legs ached from climbing over deadfall. I stopped for water near a stream. I filled my bottle with the filter, crouching on a slick rock. As I knelt there, I realized how utterly silent it was. No birdsong now, no insect hum, just the faint trickle of water. That silence sank into me. It wasn't peaceful anymore, it was heavy. I tried to shake it off and kept walking, but I couldn't help noticing how easy it would be to get turned around here. The trees all looked the same. The trail sometimes vanished under ferns and moss, and I had to backtrack to find it again. More than once, I had to check the GPS, which showed I was still heading toward the ridge but straying left or right without realizing it. At one point, I crossed an area where huge trees had fallen in a storm. They were rotting, their bark peeling off in long strips. I had to climb over them carefully, balancing with my pack. It took a long time, and when I finally got through, I couldn't find the trail again. I searched in widening circles, heart pounding harder with each passing minute until I spotted a faint blaze on a distant tree. Relief washed through me, but that relief was short. I could feel the daylight fading fast, and I still hadn't reached the ridge. I knew I needed to find a campsite soon. I found a small clearing not far from a slope. The ground was uneven, but I cleared a space for my tent between two thick trees. I set it up quickly, trying to finish before the last of the light was gone. By the time I boiled some water for dinner, the forest had gone almost completely dark. As I ate, I kept glancing around. The clearing felt cramped, as though the trees were pressing in on me. Every little sound, the crack of a twig, the rustle of leaves, snapped my attention toward the shadows. I told myself it was just animals. Out here, it was bound to be squirrels, deer, maybe even a bear moving somewhere in the distance. Still, unease sat in my stomach like a stone. I zipped myself inside the tent as soon as I finished eating. I lay in my sleeping bag, listening. The nylon walls of the tent felt paper thin, useless against whatever might be out there. Hours passed like that. I don't know if I ever fully slept. My eyes kept snapping open at the faintest sound. At one point, I heard what I thought was the slow, deliberate crunch of footsteps nearby. Not the quick scurry of an animal. Not the erratic snap of branches falling. Something heavier. I held my breath until my chest ached. The sound faded. I never heard it again. Morning brought gray light and cool air. I packed quickly, wanting to keep moving. I still had the goal of reaching the ridge, but my nerves from the night before made me want to turn back too. I chose to press forward. I figured if I got to the ridge early, I could have plenty of time to descend and camp closer to the car that night. The trail grew worse. It twisted through gullies, disappeared under ferns, reappeared faintly on higher ground. I spent more and more time checking my map and GPS. Then, around midday, I realized I hadn't seen a blaze in a long time. I walked another quarter mile and stopped. The path under my boots no longer looked like a path. It looked like random ground, covered in pine needles. I turned in a slow circle, scanning the trees. No blazes, no compacted dirt, nothing. I pulled out the GPS, but it blinked low battery. I had charged it before leaving, but the constant checking must have drained it. The signal cut in and out as the screen dimmed. I cursed under my breath, tried to mark my position, then watched it flicker out completely. Now it was just me, the compass, and the forest. I told myself to stay calm. I backtracked, or at least I thought I did. But every tree, every slope, every fallen log looked the same. I walked in what felt like circles, searching for some sign of the trail. By late afternoon, panic set in. My heart raced. My pack felt heavier. My mouth went dry no matter how much water I drank. I started rushing, pushing through brush, slipping on rocks, climbing ridges just to get a better view. But all I saw was endless forest stretching in every direction. The ridge was gone. The trail was gone. I was lost. That night I camped again, but it wasn't like before. I didn't choose a nice flat spot. I simply dropped where I was, shaking as I set up the tent. I forced myself to eat, though my stomach churned. The darkness that night felt thicker, and the sounds came back. At first it was the normal things, snapping twigs, rustling brush. But then there were heavier noises, something moving slow, pausing, moving again, always just far enough away that I couldn't see it. I lay frozen in my sleeping bag, every nerve on fire. My hand gripped the knife, though I knew it was useless against a bear. At one point, I swore I heard breathing just outside the tent. Slow, steady. My throat closed up. I didn't move for nearly an hour until it faded. The next morning, I knew I couldn't keep wandering. I needed a plan. I took out my compass and decided to head due east. I figured if I kept one direction, eventually I would hit a road, a river, something man-made. Wandering randomly would only trap me deeper. I walked all day, barely stopping. My legs shook with exhaustion. The terrain grew rougher. Steep slopes, thick undergrowth, rocks that twisted my ankles. I rationed my food. By late afternoon, I had only one meal left. My water supply was low too, and I hadn't found another stream since the day before. Then I spotted something. Not a blaze, not a trail, but a piece of old wood sticking from the ground, square-cut, weathered gray. I staggered toward it, heart racing. It looked like part of a fence post or maybe a trail marker from long ago. I searched the area, and sure enough, faintly, there was the trace of an old path curving downslope. My chest swelled with hope. I followed it. It was rough, broken, almost gone. But it was something. I hiked that path until the sun started to set. The forest thinned slightly. I thought I saw a glint of light through the trees. Something open ahead. I pushed harder, stumbling. I was 28 in the summer of 2016 when I decided to take a solo hiking trip through the northern part of Wyoming. I had always been into hiking, camping, and being alone in remote areas, but that year something in me wanted to push further. I had just quit a job that I hated, I was single, and I felt like I needed to prove something to myself. I didn't have anyone waiting at home, and I thought a few days in the backcountry would clear my head. I had studied maps for weeks and planned out a route through the Bighorn Mountains. It wasn't the most popular area compared to places like Yellowstone, but that was part of the draw. I wanted something quieter, less traveled, somewhere I could test myself. I packed my gear carefully. Tent, sleeping bag, stove, food for 5 days, water filter, bear spray, knife, first aid kit, a small map, compass, and my phone, even though I knew there would be no service once I got deeper in. The trailhead I picked was about an hour outside a small town called Buffalo. I parked my car in a gravel lot, double-checked that I had everything, and signed the trail register. It was late morning, bright blue skies, not too hot, just enough breeze to keep it comfortable. My pack felt heavy on my shoulders, but I told myself I'd adjust after the first mile. The first stretch of trail was steady uphill, winding through tall pines with shafts of sunlight cutting through. I moved at a good pace, sweating but enjoying the quiet. I only saw 2 other hikers that day, both headed back toward the lot, which meant I was going to have the upper part of the trail to myself. That was exactly what I wanted at the time. By the afternoon, I had climbed above the tree line. The view opened into wide ridges, rolling meadows, and snow patches still lingering from the winter. I found a flat spot near a stream and set up my tent for the night. I cooked a small meal of pasta and sat on a rock, watching the sun drop behind the mountains. It felt perfect, everything I thought I had come for. The first night passed easily. I slept deeply, only waking once to the sound of wind moving through the tent walls. The next morning, I packed up and pushed further into the ridge. The trail became rougher, less marked, and at times I had to rely on my compass. That didn't bother me. I had done that kind of navigation before. The second day went fine until the evening. Clouds rolled in faster than I expected, dark and heavy. By late afternoon, the temperature dropped sharply. I could hear thunder in the distance, bouncing between the mountains. I hurried to find a campsite lower in the valley, near some clusters of trees, hoping they would give me some shelter. That storm hit hard. Rain hammered the tent for hours. Lightning flashed so bright that it lit the whole valley like daylight for a split second. Then thunder cracked so loud I felt it in my chest. I sat awake for a long time, hugging my knees, waiting for it to pass. By morning, the storm was gone, but the ground was soaked and muddy. My map had gotten wet even though I thought I had sealed it properly. Parts of it had blurred, and while I could still make out the general route, the smaller details were harder to read. I brushed it off, telling myself I knew the direction well enough. That day was slower. The trail was hard to follow in places, with runoff cutting across it. By mid-afternoon, I realized I wasn't exactly where I thought I should be. I recognized the ridgeline, but the landmarks didn't match the map. I convinced myself it was fine, that I was still on track, just maybe a little off the intended route. I set up camp on a rocky ledge with a view of the valley below. That night, something shifted. I didn't sleep well. I woke often to small sounds, rocks shifting, twigs snapping. Each time I told myself it was wind or small animals, but the feeling in my stomach was different. I felt exposed, vulnerable. The fourth day is when everything really went wrong. I woke early, packed, and started downhill, thinking I was circling back toward the main trail. The terrain got steeper, looser. My boots slipped often on wet rocks. By noon, I realized I had gone into a drainage that wasn't on my map at all. The valley was narrow, the walls steep. I decided to climb back up to higher ground, but that climb drained me fast. The pack dug into my shoulders, my thighs burned, and every step seemed to slide back half the distance. At one point, I put my hand on a loose rock and it gave way. My balance went out. I slid down several feet, scraping my arm, banging my hip hard. I stopped just before the slope dropped further. For a moment I sat there, heart racing, dust in my mouth, realizing how close I had come to a real fall. I forced myself up and kept climbing. Took hours to get out of that drainage, and by the time I reached the ridge, the sun was already low. I could see no sign of the trail, no cairns, nothing familiar. Just endless ridges stretching in every direction. My compass pointed me roughly west, but the land twisted so much that I couldn't tell what was the right way anymore. That night, I camped in a small patch of grass surrounded by boulders. I barely ate, too tired and worried. I kept hearing things again. Rocks shifting, faint cracks of branches. My nerves were shot. I gripped the bear spray in my hand while I lay in my sleeping bag, eyes wide open, waiting for morning. The 5th day, I tried to ration water. I had been filtering from streams, but the last valley had none. My bottle was half empty, and the sun was relentless. I forced myself to move, legs shaking, shoulders aching under the pack. My mouth went dry, tongue sticking to my teeth. By mid-afternoon, I finally found a small pool of water in a rocky dip. I dropped to my knees, filtered it slowly, and drank until my stomach cramped. The relief was huge, but I also knew I had no idea where I was anymore. That evening, I noticed something that froze me. On a patch of dirt near the pool, there were boot prints. Not mine. They were older, edges softened, but definitely human. For a moment, I felt relief, proof that someone else had been through here. Then the unease sank in. If there had been people, why hadn't I seen any? How long ago were these prints made? I followed them for a while, but they faded into rocks and disappeared. I was alone again, standing in a valley that seemed endless. The 6th day was the hardest. My food was running low. I had been eating small handfuls of trail mix, stretching meals into almost nothing. My body felt hollow, weak. My legs shook constantly. I tried to keep moving west, thinking I had to hit a road or trail eventually. By late afternoon, clouds rolled in again. A cold rain began, soaking me through. I pulled on my rain jacket, but it barely helped. The wind cut straight through me. I kept walking until I couldn't anymore. I found a shallow overhang in the rocks and crawled under it, shivering. That night, something approached my camp. I heard slow, heavy steps on the wet ground. My heart hammered as I clutched the bear spray, straining to hear. The steps moved closer, then paused. I could hear my own breath shaking. Then the sound moved away, fading into the rain. I never saw what it was. I sat awake all night, too scared to close my eyes. By the 7th morning, I knew I couldn't last much longer. I forced myself up, body stiff and aching. My face felt swollen, lips cracked. I packed slowly, each movement heavy, and began walking again. Around noon, I climbed another ridge and froze. In the distance, cutting through the trees, was a dirt road. It looked unreal, like something out of a dream. I stumbled down the slope, tripping, sliding, my pack banging into me. When I reached it, I dropped to my knees, touching the ruts in the dirt as if to make sure it was real. I followed the road for hours, not knowing where it led. My legs shook with every step, but I refused to stop. Finally, as the light faded, I saw a small wooden sign nailed to a post. It was weathered, but I could read it. Forest Service Road 327. I knew that meant people used it. Maybe not often, but it had to connect somewhere. I kept going, each step painful, until I saw headlights in the distance. A pickup truck crawled toward me, its engine loud in the quiet. I staggered into the middle of the road, waving my arms. The truck slowed, then stopped. A man got out, eyes wide when he saw me. I must have looked terrible, mud, cuts, hollow cheeks. I couldn't speak at first. My throat was too dry, my mind too scrambled, but the relief in that moment was overwhelming. He gave me water, then drove me out of the mountains. It took over an hour to reach the nearest small town, where he dropped me at a gas station. I sat outside on the curb, drinking from a plastic bottle, staring at the lights of cars passing on the highway, still trying to believe I was out. I had been lost for 3 days longer than planned. My body was worn down, but I was alive. I had pushed further than I should have, trusted too much in myself, and nearly paid the price. Even now, years later, I can still hear those footsteps in the rain, and I still remember the feeling of touching that dirt road for the first time. My name is Daniel Hayes, and I was 34 years old when this happened. It was the summer of 2017, and I had been living in Colorado for a few years. I worked as a mechanic during the week, and on weekends I usually went hiking to clear my head. I wasn't the most experienced outdoorsman, but I was confident enough in my skills. I read trail maps carefully, packed my gear properly, and had done dozens of solo hikes before. Nothing ever went wrong, at least not in any serious way. That changed one weekend in July. I had taken Friday off work and wanted to make the most of the long weekend. Instead of sticking to the usual day hikes near Boulder, I decided to drive further out and explore a trail system I hadn't tried before. I picked an area in the San Juan Mountains, outside a small town I hadn't visited before. The place wasn't popular with tourists. The trails looked rougher, less maintained, but still manageable. The map I found online showed several paths that connected through valleys and ridges, some with campsites marked along the way. My plan was to hike in Friday afternoon, camp for one night, then loop around and come back to my car Saturday evening. It sounded simple enough. I left home late in the morning and drove for several hours through winding mountain roads. The deeper I got into the mountains, the more remote it felt. By the time I reached the dirt road that led to the trailhead, I realized I hadn't seen another vehicle for nearly an hour. I pulled into the small gravel lot where the trail began. Only 2 other cars were parked there. The air was hot and dry, with the sun sitting high above me. I got out, stretched, and checked my gear. I had a sturdy backpack with a sleeping bag strapped to it, a small tent, a lightweight stove, food for 2 days, plenty of water, and a filter pump in case I needed more. I had a knife, a headlamp, an extra flashlight, a map, and a compass. My phone had no service, which I expected. I took one last look at the lot and started walking. The first few miles were easy. The trail cut through a pine forest with patches of sunlight breaking through. The ground was soft with needles, and birds called above me. I followed the map closely and checked landmarks as I went. By mid-afternoon, I reached a clearing that overlooked a valley. The view stretched for miles, hazy ridges stacked one behind another, a thin river glinting far below. I stopped to drink water and rest. That was the last time the hike felt normal. I continued on, but the trail grew narrower and less defined. Fallen branches and overgrown brush blocked sections, forcing me to step carefully. I checked the map often, but it didn't always match what I saw. Some parts of the trail looked abandoned, as if no one had walked them in months. Still, I pushed on, convinced that I was fine. Around 5 in the evening, I reached a flat area near a creek where I decided to set up camp. The ground was level enough for my tent, and the creek gave me water to filter. I pitched my tent, cooked a small meal, and sat on a rock while the sun went down. The forest around me was quiet, almost too quiet. When the dark came, it came fast. I crawled into my tent, zipped it shut, and tried to sleep. That night was restless. I woke several times to faint noises outside. Snaps, rustles, the sound of something moving through the brush. I told myself it was just animals. Deer, maybe. The noises came and went, and eventually I drifted back into uneasy sleep. In the morning, I packed up and studied the map again. My plan was to follow the trail along the creek, then cut back toward the ridge, making a loop that would lead me back toward the parking lot by evening. The sun was already hot when I started. I followed the faint path, but within half an hour, I realized something was wrong. The trail kept fading. What should have been clear lines through the trees turned into scattered patches of dirt that disappeared into tall grass. I checked the map, looked for blazes or markers, but found nothing. I circled back, tried again, and still couldn't find the right path. By late morning, I had been wandering for nearly an hour with no clear sense of direction. I told myself not to panic. I had a compass. I knew the general direction of the ridge I needed to reach. I turned west and started climbing gradually uphill. The terrain grew steeper and rockier. My legs ached, and sweat soaked my shirt. Every few minutes I checked behind me, trying to keep track of landmarks, but the trees all looked the same. At one point, I stumbled onto what looked like an old game trail, narrow and winding. It wasn't on the map, but it led uphill, so I followed it. For the next hour, I moved slowly, ducking under branches, stepping over loose rocks. The sun beat down through gaps in the canopy, and the air grew heavy. My water supply was shrinking faster than I wanted. Then I heard it, the sound of movement again. It wasn't close, but it was steady. A crunch of leaves, a snap of a branch. I froze, listening. The sound stopped. I turned, scanning the trees. Nothing. I stood there for a long minute, heart pounding, before forcing myself to keep going. By mid-afternoon, I was exhausted. My legs burned, and my throat was dry. I had reached a ridge, but when I looked out, I didn't recognize anything. No landmarks matched the map. The valley below me was unfamiliar, with ridges I hadn't seen before. I had gone the wrong way. That realization hit me harder than anything else. I was lost. I dropped my pack and sat on a rock, trying to think clearly. My options were limited. I could try to backtrack, but I had already lost the trail. I could push forward and hope to find another marked path, but I had no guarantee. My only solid choice was to ration my supplies, keep moving in one direction, and hope I eventually reached a road or another hiker. As I sat there, I noticed something that unsettled me more than being lost. On the ground, a few yards from where I had dropped my pack, were footprints. They weren't mine. They looked fresh, pressed deep into the dirt, leading away into the trees. Someone else had been here recently. The strange part was that the footprints didn't follow any trail. They cut diagonally across the ridge, into thick brush where no clear path existed. I stared at them for a long time, debating whether to follow or ignore them. Eventually, I decided to keep moving west, away from the prints. The hours dragged on. My water ran low, and the sun sank lower in the sky. I stumbled through brush and over rocks, scratching my legs, bruising my shins. I slipped once on loose gravel and scraped my forearm badly. Blood trickled down, but I wrapped it in a bandana and kept going. By the time the sun was setting, I knew I had to stop. I found a small clearing under a cluster of pines and set up my tent again. I cooked another meal with what little fuel I had left, ate slowly, and drank the last of my water. The creek I had camped by the night before was far behind me. I would need to find water soon, or things would get serious. That night was worse than the first. The noises came back. This time, they were closer. I heard distinct steps in the brush, slow and deliberate, circling the edge of the clearing. My skin prickled with fear. I held my knife in one hand inside the tent and stayed perfectly still. The steps came and went for what felt like hours before fading into silence. When dawn broke, I was already awake, exhausted and tense. I packed up quickly and pushed on, determined to find water and a way out. I moved downhill, reasoning that streams and rivers always ran down to valleys where roads or towns might be. The descent was rough. I slipped multiple times, tore my pants on thorns, and nearly twisted my ankle on loose rocks. By noon, I found water, a muddy stream trickling through a gully. I pumped and filtered enough to fill my bottles, grateful for something to drink. I rested there for a while, then kept going. That was when I saw the footprints again. On the muddy bank of the stream, clear as day, were prints. Not boots like mine, but bare feet. Large, wide, with toes pressing deep into the mud. They looked fresh. They followed the stream downhill. I can't explain the chill that went through me then. I didn't follow them. I turned and went the opposite direction along the stream, uphill. The idea of running into whoever made those prints filled me with dread. Something about being lost in the woods with no contact, no safety, and knowing someone else was out there, moving barefoot through the forest, felt wrong in every possible way. The day stretched on and I grew weaker. My food was running low, my legs ached, and every sound in the forest put me on edge. I saw no one, no cabins, no sign of roads, just endless trees and ridges. That night, I didn't set up the tent. I was too tired. I curled up against a log with my pack under my head and tried to stay awake. Again, the noises came, Steps, breaking branches, slow movement through the brush. This time, I was sure it was following me. The fear was overwhelming. Morning came like a gift. My body ached, but I forced myself up and kept going. I climbed a ridge, hoping to see something, anything that looked. My name is Daniel, and in the summer of 2014, I was 28 years old. At the time, I lived in Colorado Springs, and I had started to push myself into longer and more remote hiking trips. I had done dozens of short hikes around the Front Range, but I wanted something harder, something that would test me. I had some vacation time saved up, and instead of traveling somewhere far, I decided to spend it hiking in a section of the San Juan Mountains I had never explored before. I picked out a loop trail I had read about in an old guidebook, a rugged route that connected several smaller trails into one long circuit. It wasn't one of the big popular thru hikes. In fact, I had a hard time finding much about it online. That made me more interested. I liked the idea of being alone out there, away from the crowds that packed the well-known routes. The plan was simple: park at a small trailhead outside of Lake City, hike the loop over 4 days, and then drive home. I packed enough food for 5 days just in case things went slower. I had a one-man tent, a decent sleeping bag, a water filter, and all the usual gear. I had hiked solo plenty of times, and even though I had never done a full loop this long, I felt ready for it. The morning I left, the weather was clear. The air was crisp but not cold, and the sky looked like it would stay steady for a while. I parked at a dirt pull-off that served as the small trailhead. There was only one other car parked there, old and dusty. I didn't see anyone around. I started hiking with a kind of nervous excitement. The trail began wide and easy, cutting through aspen trees that still had green leaves thick overhead. The first few miles went quickly. My pack felt heavy, but that always happened at the start before I ate through food weight. The trail narrowed as it went on, the aspens fading into thick spruce and pine. I could hear nothing but my boots crunching dirt and the occasional call of a bird. The first day was uneventful, and that was exactly what I wanted. I crossed 2 creeks, filled up my water, and made it to a small meadow where I set up camp. The meadow was flat and open, with mountains rising up behind the trees. I boiled water, ate a freeze-dried meal, and watched the sun dip behind the ridge. I remember feeling calm and proud of myself for finally committing to this kind of trip. The second day started early. I broke camp, tightened my boots, and headed further along the loop. This section of the trail climbed steadily, switchbacking up the side of a mountain. It was hot work, and sweat soaked through my shirt. At one point, I stopped to catch my breath and looked out over the valley. The view stretched for miles. I could see the winding line of the trail far below. By midday, I had crossed above treeline. The path thinned into rocky dirt, cutting along the slope with sharp drop-offs to the left. I had to focus on every step. The exposure made me tense, but the weather held, and I kept moving. The trail eventually dropped back into another patch of forest, thick and dark. The trees blocked out much of the sunlight, and the ground was damp. That afternoon, something began to feel off. I couldn't explain why at first. The forest was silent in a way that felt unnatural. Normally, even in quiet stretches, there would be birds or insects, some kind of noise. Here, it was still. The only sound was my boots on the soft earth. Every time I stopped, I expected to hear something, but there was nothing. I pushed the thought away and told myself I was just noticing things more because I was alone. I followed the trail down into a narrow canyon where a small creek trickled along the bottom. The walls rose steeply on both sides, and the trail hugged the edge of the creek. That night, I camped in a clearing near the water. I built a small fire since I was low enough for it to be safe. The fire gave me comfort, but I couldn't shake the feeling that the silence in the woods wasn't right. I lay in my tent, listening, and the absence of sound pressed on me. Eventually, exhaustion won, and I slept. The third day changed everything. I woke at dawn, ate a quick breakfast, and packed up. The trail climbed sharply out of the canyon, and I followed it up until the trees began to thin again. The higher I went, the more rugged the path became. It wasn't well maintained here. Sections were washed out, and in some places I had to scramble over loose rock. Around midday, clouds began to build. Thunder rolled in the distance. I picked up my pace, trying to cross the exposed ridge before the storm broke. The wind grew stronger, and the air felt charged. I made it over the high point and started down the other side when the first drops hit. The rain turned heavy fast. The dirt trail became slick mud, and water poured down in rivulets. I slipped more than once, catching myself on branches. My pack felt twice as heavy, and the storm made visibility poor. I decided to stop earlier than planned and set up camp before things got worse. I found a flat spot under some trees and pitched my tent as quickly as I could. By the time I got inside, I was soaked through. I changed into dry clothes, crawled into my sleeping bag, and listened to the rain hammer down. The storm raged for hours. Lightning cracked overhead so close it shook the ground. When it finally eased toward evening, I stepped outside to check the area. That's when I noticed something that made my stomach knot. Just off the trail, no more than 50 yards away, was another tent. It hadn't been there when I stopped, and I hadn't heard anyone set it up. It was small, older looking, maybe canvas or just weathered nylon. No light came from inside. I stood there in the damp woods, staring at it. The hair on my arms rose. It wasn't the fact that another hiker was there. That should have been reassuring. It was the way it appeared silently in that heavy storm, as if it had been placed there without me noticing. I went back to my tent, zipped the flap, and sat in the dim light of my headlamp. Couldn't relax. Every rustle outside put me on edge. The other tent stayed dark and still. I barely slept that night, lying awake with my knife close at hand. Morning came gray and wet. I stepped out and looked toward the spot where I had seen the tent. The ground was empty. No tent, no sign of a person, not even footprints in the mud. Cold feeling spread through me. I told myself maybe I had imagined it in the storm, maybe my tired brain had played tricks. But the image of that faded tent was burned into me. I decided to push on faster. My plan had been 4 days, but I figured I could cut it to 3 if I kept moving. The trail narrowed again as it wound through another canyon. The silence returned, thicker than before. By afternoon, I had the sense I wasn't alone. Every so often I felt eyes on me. Once, when I glanced behind, I thought I saw movement in the trees, a shadow that ducked back just as I turned. My chest tightened, but I forced myself to keep a steady pace. That night, I made the mistake of camping too close to the trail. I was exhausted and didn't want to search for a better spot. I set up quickly and ate cold food instead of cooking. Darkness fell fast in the canyon. Lying in my tent, I heard something for the first time in days. Footsteps, slow, deliberate, moving along the trail outside. They crunched on gravel, paused, then continued. They were heavy enough to be human, not an animal. My body went rigid. I held my breath, listening. The steps stopped near my tent. I could hear breathing, faint but there. My heart pounded so hard I thought it would give me away. After what felt like an hour but was likely only a minute, the sound moved on, fading down the trail. I didn't sleep. I stayed frozen until the first light of dawn. When I finally stepped out, the ground was wet with dew. I searched for prints, but the trail was rocky there, and I couldn't see any clear signs. The last stretch of the loop was the longest, but I pushed myself harder than I ever had. My legs burned, my shoulders ached, but I didn't stop. Every bend in the trail felt like it would reveal someone standing there, waiting. Late that evening, I stumbled back to the trailhead. My car was exactly where I left it. The old dusty car I had seen on day 1 was gone. I threw my pack in the back, climbed into the driver's seat, and locked the doors before I even started the engine. When I pulled away, relief washed over me, but it was mixed with a deep unease. I don't know who or what was out there with me on that loop. Maybe it was just another hiker who preferred to stay hidden, or maybe someone who wasn't supposed to be out there at all. What I do know is that I was never truly alone on that trail, no matter how quiet the forest seemed. I never went back to that part of the San Juans. I kept hiking, but I stuck to busier routes after that. To this day, when I camp alone, I think about that silent tent and those footsteps outside mine. and I always make sure I set up camp far, far away from the trail. My name is Daniel. I was 32 years old when this happened, back in the summer of 2014. I had been living in Oregon for about 4 years at that point, and hiking had become one of the few things that truly cleared my head. I had grown up in Ohio, where the trails were mostly flat, short, and crowded, so moving west gave me access to mountains, dense forests, and huge stretches of wilderness where you could walk all day without seeing another person. I had already hiked many of the popular trails near Portland, like Eagle Creek and Multnomah Falls, but I wanted something quieter. That summer, I made a habit of driving farther out every weekend, looking for lesser-known trails. I would search online maps and sometimes just follow back roads until I saw a sign for a trailhead. It was risky at times, but that was part of the appeal. I liked the feeling of stepping into the unknown. On a Saturday in late July, I set out alone for what I thought would be a simple day hike. I had no big plans, just a backpack with some water, jerky, a sandwich, a flashlight, a cheap rain jacket, and a paper map of the county that didn't show much detail. My phone had service in town, but I knew that in the mountains I would probably lose signal, so I never relied on it. That morning was warm but cloudy, the kind of sky that looked like it could stay gray all day or suddenly break into sunshine. I drove for about 2 hours east into the Cascades, past small towns and logging roads, until the pavement ended and gravel took over. I wasn't entirely sure where I was going, but I wasn't too worried. The forest was beautiful. Tall evergreens, thick undergrowth, and the sound of streams running near the road. After another 20 minutes of slow driving on gravel, I saw a small wooden sign nailed to a post that simply said, "Trail." An arrow pointed down a narrow dirt road that disappeared into the trees. It wasn't an official state park sign, just something rough, but I pulled in anyway. The road was rutted and full of potholes, so I parked my car a few hundred yards in, where there was a clearing just big enough for one vehicle, and continued on foot. The trailhead wasn't marked except for a break in the brush where a faint path led upward into the forest. It looked used but not heavily maintained. I figured it was some old Forest Service trail or maybe a local hiking spot that wasn't listed on the maps. That excited me. I strapped my pack tight, checked my watch. It was around 10:15 a.m. and started walking. The first stretch of trail climbed steadily uphill through thick fir and cedar trees. The air was damp and smelled of pine needles and soil. The path was narrow, uneven, and scattered with fallen branches, but easy enough to follow. I enjoyed the quiet, hearing nothing but my own footsteps and the occasional bird. After about an hour, the trail leveled out along a ridge. I could see glimpses of the valley below through the trees. My shirt was damp with sweat, and I stopped to drink water and eat a little jerky. The silence was heavier up there. I remember thinking how odd it was that I hadn't seen any trail markers, no blazes on trees, no mileage signs, nothing. That didn't bother me too much at first, though. Some trails were like that. I pushed on, curious to see where the path would lead. At times it narrowed so much that ferns brushed my legs, and I had to duck under fallen logs. Other stretches opened into mossy clearings where sunlight filtered through. It felt wild, untouched. After 2 more hours, I expected the trail to loop back or lead to some lookout, but instead it kept climbing. I was tired but determined. My plan was simple: follow it until about 2 p.m., then turn around no matter where I was. That way I'd have plenty of daylight to get back. By noon, I was deep in the forest, far beyond where I could hear any cars or see any sign of human activity. I came across an old fire ring in a small clearing, just a few blackened stones, long and used. That was the first proof I saw that anyone else had been there. Not long after, I reached a fork in the trail. One path continued upward, faint but visible. The other curved downhill to the right, even narrower, almost overgrown. There were no signs, no markers. I hesitated. My instinct was to stay on the main path, but the downhill branch caught my eye. I thought maybe it led to a creek or a hidden spot. I chose the right fork. At first it seemed fine, but within 10 minutes the trail nearly vanished. Brush crowded in, and fallen branches blocked the way. I pressed forward, convinced it would open up again. I should have turned back, but I didn't. The ground sloped steeply downward, and the soil was loose. I had to grab trees to steady myself. Eventually, I reached a gully where water must have run during spring. Now it was just mud and rocks. The trail, if it even was one, was gone. I stood there, breathing hard, realizing I had probably walked off the actual path. I checked my watch. It was almost 1 p.m. and decided to climb back up. But when I turned, the hillside looked confusing. There were multiple faint tracks, gaps in the brush that all looked the same. I couldn't tell which way I had come down. For the first time that day, I felt uneasy. I picked what looked like the clearest way back and started climbing. After 20 minutes of scrambling upward, I reached a small rise only to find more thick forest. No trail. I backtracked, tried another direction. Still nothing. The hillside was a maze of trees, deadfall, and brush. I pulled out my map, but it was useless. It only showed highways and major rivers, not these small trails. My phone had no signal. I told myself not to panic. I still had plenty of daylight, food, and water. If I kept calm, I could find my way back. I decided to move uphill, reasoning that the original trail had been climbing. If I gained enough elevation, I might intersect it again. So I kept pushing upward, grabbing roots and rocks, sliding on loose dirt. My arms and legs were scratched by branches. After an hour, I reached a ridge top, sweating and exhausted. From there, I expected to see the main trail, but all I saw was endless forest in every direction. No clear path, no landmarks, just trees and more ridges rolling into the distance. That's when the weight of my mistake hit me. I was lost. At first, I tried to treat it like a challenge. I rationed my water, checked the sun's position, and chose a direction, west, where I thought the road had been. I figured if I kept moving west, I'd eventually hit a road or a stream that led to one. But the terrain worked against me. The ridges twisted and dropped, forcing me to climb up and down steep slopes. Thickets of brush slowed me to a crawl. At one point, I slipped on loose soil and slid several feet, scraping my arms. My ankle twisted, not badly but enough to throb with every step. By late afternoon, I was worn down and moving slower. I found a small clearing and sat to eat my sandwich, but my stomach was knotted, and I could barely swallow. The silence of the forest pressed in. There were no voices, no engines, not even the distant sound of airplanes. Just the occasional rustle of something unseen in the undergrowth. When the sun began sinking, panic rose. I had no tent, no sleeping bag, just a thin rain jacket and flashlight. I had never planned to stay out overnight. I searched frantically for a flat spot and ended up in a hollow between trees where the ground was damp but at least level. I cleared some sticks, sat with my back to a log, and waited for darkness. The forest at night is not silent. Every crack of a twig or rustle of leaves feels amplified. I kept jerking my head at shadows, imagining animals watching me. I knew black bears lived in the Cascades, maybe cougars. I had no weapon beyond a small pocket knife. The temperature dropped sharply. I pulled on my jacket, hugged my knees, and tried not to shiver. My flashlight beam barely pierced the darkness. I forced myself to conserve the batteries, turning it off most of the time, but then the dark felt unbearable. Sleep came in short bursts. I would drift off only to wake at every sound. At one point, I was sure I heard footsteps nearby, slow and heavy, crunching leaves. My throat tightened as I held my breath, straining to listen. The sound faded, but I didn't sleep again for hours. When dawn finally came, pale light seeping through the trees, relief flooded me. I was stiff, cold, and hungry, but I had made it through the night. I forced myself to keep moving west. My ankle was swollen but usable. I rationed my water carefully, sipping only when necessary. Sweat drenched me as I climbed ridge after ridge, only to find more trees. By mid-morning, I stumbled into a marshy area where my shoes sank into mud. Mosquitoes swarmed, biting relentlessly. I hurried through, but not before losing my footing and soaking one leg to the knee. The cold water made the ankle ache worse. I found a stream later that afternoon, Relief hit me. I could refill my bottle, at least. I used purification tablets I always carried just in case. The water was cold and clean, the best thing I had tasted all day. I followed the stream downstream, hoping it would lead. I was 26 in the summer of 2013 when I decided to take a long solo hike in the northern part of Idaho. I had been working long hours at a warehouse job, the kind that grinds you down, day after day, until all you want is some silence and open air. I had saved up a little time off and figured I could give myself a challenge. I planned for 3 days in the Selway Bitterroot Wilderness, carrying everything I needed in a heavy pack. I had hiked before, but nothing this long on my own. I bought a topographic map, a compass, a new headlamp, extra food, and a small emergency kit. My boots were already broken in, which I thought would be enough. I knew there were bears in the area, but I had a can of spray clipped to the side of my pack. I told myself it would be fine. The trail started wide and easy. Pines stretched up on both sides, and the air smelled sharp with sap. The river ran close for the first few miles, its constant sound both calming and a reminder of how far from the city I already was. The sun came through the trees in broken strips, making everything look alive. I remember thinking how lucky I was to even be there. The first day went smooth. I covered almost 10 miles, sweating hard under the pack but feeling good about the pace. I set up camp near a clearing where the river bent, cooked a freeze-dried meal with my little stove, and crawled into the tent as the night came in. The sky filled with stars in a way I hadn't seen since I was a kid. There was no hum of traffic, no glow from buildings, just the endless dark and the cold air. That first night I slept heavy. The next morning, I woke to the sound of branches moving. My heart kicked for a second, but when I looked out, it was just a deer nosing around near the river. I boiled some water, ate oatmeal, packed up, and moved on. The second day was harder. The trail narrowed and began to climb. Loose rock shifted under my boots, and the pack pulled at my shoulders until the muscles burned. The sun stayed high and hot, and I drained water faster than I wanted to. I had a filter pump, but finding the right places to fill up meant stepping off the trail and down to the stream, which cost time and energy. By the afternoon, the quiet that had felt so nice earlier began to press on me. There were no voices, no signs of people. I hadn't seen anyone since I parked the car at the trailhead. Every sound in the trees, snaps, calls, rustles, took on more weight. I told myself it was just animals, birds mostly, maybe squirrels. Still, my eyes kept checking the corners of the trail, and my ears tuned sharp to every shift of noise. I stopped to rest on a fallen log, drank from my bottle, and studied the map. The trail wound upward, then across a ridge, then down toward a basin where I thought I'd camp for the second night. I still had 4 miles to go, but daylight was slipping. I got up, adjusted the straps, and pushed on. The ridge was the hardest part. Wind cut across it, sharp and cold, even though the sun hadn't fully dropped. The path was narrow, a steep fall on one side, thick trees on the other. My boots scuffed on loose gravel, and more than once I had to grab a branch to steady myself. At one point, I looked back and saw how far down the valley ran. It made my stomach turn. I finally reached the basin near dusk. It was wide, with tall grass and a stream running through it. I set up camp near the tree line, thinking it would block some of the wind. My body ached all over, and I ate quickly, barely tasting the food. By the time I lay down, I was already half asleep. That night was different. I woke to a sound outside the tent. It was soft at first, like something moving through grass. I lay still, holding my breath. The sound came again, closer this time. My mind ran through what it could be: deer, elk, maybe even a bear. I reached slowly for the can of spray, hands shaking. The steps circled the tent, slow and steady. I gripped the can tighter, eyes wide in the dark. Then, after what felt like forever, the sound moved off into the distance. I didn't sleep much after that. When the gray light came, I packed faster than I ever had before. I was tired, but I wanted to get moving. The map showed another long stretch ahead, and I thought if I pushed hard enough, I could make it close to the end by night. The trail turned rougher. Fallen branches blocked parts of it, and the climb went on longer than I expected. My thighs burned, and blisters started to form on both feet. Every step rubbed raw skin, and I cursed myself for not bringing better tape. Around midday, I stopped to eat some jerky and rest. That's when I noticed the sound again. Branches snapping somewhere behind me. I froze, listening. It wasn't the quick scatter of a squirrel or bird. It was slower, heavier. I turned, scanning the trees, but saw nothing. The woods stood silent, waiting. I swallowed hard, packed up quick, and kept walking. For the next hour, I felt it. Something keeping pace behind me. Every time I stopped, the woods stopped too. The back of my neck prickled, and my chest felt tight. I told myself it was an animal, maybe curious, maybe just moving the same way. But the feeling stayed. The trail dipped into a darker section of forest, where the trees closed in and blocked out most of the light. The air was damp, cooler. My boots squelched in patches of mud. The silence grew heavier. That's when I saw it. Muddy boot prints in front of me. They weren't mine. The size looked close, but the tread pattern was different. They were fresh too, pressed deep into the wet ground. My stomach twisted. I hadn't seen another hiker the whole time, and these tracks hadn't been there yesterday. I kept moving, slower now, eyes darting between the trail and the trees. The prints led the same way I was going. I followed them for nearly a mile before they cut suddenly off the trail into the woods. I stopped, staring at the broken grass and snapped branches. Whoever it was had left the trail on purpose. My chest felt hollow. I didn't want to follow, but I also didn't want to stay. I pushed on faster, almost jogging, the pack bouncing hard against my back. My breath came sharp, and sweat stung my eyes. By late afternoon, the trail began to descend toward another stream. I thought about camping early, but the unease kept me going. I wanted out, wanted to see the end of the trailhead sign and the safety of my car. The forest grew thicker, shadows stretching long as the sun dropped. My legs felt like stone, my feet raw. Then I heard it again. Steps behind me, closer this time. I didn't turn right away. I just kept walking, trying to act like I hadn't noticed. But the steps matched mine, quicker when I quickened, slower when I slowed. Finally, I spun around, heart slamming. The trail behind me was empty, just trees and silence. I stood there, chest heaving, gripping the spray so tight my hand ached. I forced myself forward, moving fast now, stumbling on roots and rocks. The light was fading, and I knew I couldn't go much farther in the dark. I found a small clearing and set up the tent with clumsy hands, barely eating before crawling inside. That night was the longest of my life. Every sound outside felt like footsteps. I lay awake, clutching the spray, eyes fixed on the thin fabric of the tent. Once, I swore I saw a shadow move across it, blocking the faint moonlight. I didn't breathe until it passed. When morning came, I tore down camp in minutes. I didn't even bother with breakfast. I just wanted out. My body screamed with every step, but I pushed harder than ever. Hours later, I saw the trailhead sign through the trees. Relief hit so hard I almost cried. My car sat there, untouched, waiting. I dropped the pack into the back seat, climbed in, and locked the doors. My hands shook as I turned the key. I drove the dirt road fast, glancing in the rearview mirror over and over. The forest seemed to lean in on both sides, as if it wanted to keep me. Only when the road turned to pavement and I saw another car coming the other way did I start to feel real air in my lungs again. I never found out who made those prints. Maybe it was another hiker, maybe a hunter, maybe something worse. All I knew was the feeling, the sense of being watched, followed, toyed with. It stayed with me long after the hike ended. I haven't gone back to that wilderness since. I still hike, but never alone, and never without looking behind me every so often. The memory of those steps, steady and close, is enough to keep me cautious. That trip taught me something I didn't expect. The woods aren't haunted by spirits or stories. They're haunted by the unknown, the living, breathing kind. Out there, far from anyone else, you learn quickly how small you really are and how close danger can be without ever showing its face. My name is Daniel Reed, and this happened in the summer of 2012 when I was 31 years old. I had been living in Colorado for several years by then, working long hours as a mechanic, and hiking was the one thing I did to clear my head when everything else in life felt too heavy. I never hiked in groups, never really cared for that. I liked the silence and the stillness of being alone out in the woods and mountains. That summer I decided to take a few days off work and try a trail I had been reading about in some outdoor magazines. It wasn't the most popular route, not one of those overrun paths where you bump into someone every 20 minutes. It was a stretch of rugged forest in northern New Mexico, in the Carson National Forest, that went from a valley up through a high ridge, winding for nearly 15 miles before dropping back down into a different canyon. I had seen pictures of the terrain: dense pine woods, rocky slopes, open meadows, streams cutting through thick brush. The plan was simple: drive down, start early in the morning, hike until mid-afternoon, set up camp somewhere along the ridge, then finish the trail the next day. I had done longer hikes before, even multi-day trips, so I wasn't nervous. I knew how to pack light but smart, how to ration food and water, how to handle myself if weather changed fast. I thought I had prepared for just about everything. That trip proved me wrong. I parked my truck at a small gravel pull-off just past dawn. There was one other vehicle, a dusty SUV, with plates from Texas. I figured someone else had gone up ahead of me, but I didn't expect to see them. I tightened the straps of my pack, locked the truck, and started walking. The trailhead was marked by a faded wooden sign, almost hidden by overgrowth. The first part of the trail was narrow, weaving through aspen trees that leaned across the path. The ground was still damp from the night air, and my boots sank slightly into patches of soft soil. Birds were making noise overhead, and somewhere off in the trees I could hear the steady trickle of water. It was calm, peaceful, the kind of morning that made me glad I had left everything else behind for a while. For the first couple hours, it was easy going. The sun broke through the trees, warming the air. The forest smelled sharp, like pine sap and dirt. I stopped once or twice to sip water and take in the view. By mid-morning, the trees thinned, and the trail began to climb. The slope was gradual but steady, and the air grew cooler as I gained elevation. Around noon, I found a flat stretch of rock that overlooked a wide valley. I sat down, pulled off my pack, and ate some jerky and nuts. The view was incredible: green hills rolling into one another, with streaks of yellow grassland further out. For a while, I thought about how far away everything felt, how I hadn't seen another person since I left the truck. That should have been relaxing, but something about the stillness gave me a strange edge I couldn't shake. It wasn't fear, not yet, but more of an alertness, like my body knew to pay attention. I brushed it off, chalking it up to being alone in an unfamiliar place. The trail grew rougher in the afternoon. Roots twisted out of the dirt, and fallen branches forced me to step carefully. I noticed signs of elk and deer, tracks pressed into the mud, droppings, stripped bark. The higher I went, the quieter it became. The air had that high mountain thinness to it, and the breeze rattled the branches like dry bones. It was maybe 3 in the afternoon when I started thinking about where to camp. I didn't want to push too far and risk stumbling around in the dark. After another mile or so, I found a small clearing, ringed by boulders, with enough flat space for my tent. There was even a fire pit someone had built from rocks, though I knew I wouldn't be lighting one. The forest was too dry, and I wasn't about to start a wildfire. I dropped my pack, stretched my back, and started setting up. I pitched the tent quickly and laid out my sleeping bag. I filtered water from a trickling stream nearby and cooked a small meal on my stove. Just rice and a packet of chicken I had sealed. The sun dipped low, bleeding orange light across the trees. By the time I cleaned up and packed everything away, the sky was turning dark. I sat outside the tent for a while, just listening to the forest. Crickets started up, and far off I thought I heard an elk bugle. It echoed faintly, rising and falling until it faded into the night. I crawled into my tent when the cold began to bite, zipped the flap shut, and tried to sleep. I don't know what time it was when I woke up, but the forest was silent. Not quiet, silent. No crickets, no wind, nothing. I opened my eyes, staring into the dark nylon above me, and my body was tense before I even understood why. It was the kind of silence that pressed down on you, unnatural in a place that had been full of noise just hours before. I held still, listening. That was when I heard it, a sound of movement outside, not the scamper of a raccoon or the light step of a deer. It was heavier, slow, deliberate, crunch of leaves, snap of a branch. I sat up, straining my ears. The steps circled, coming closer, then stopping. My chest tightened, and I felt every beat of my heart in my throat. I tried to tell myself it was an elk, maybe even a bear, but something about the way it moved felt different, too careful, almost measured. I sat there for what felt like an hour, but the sounds eventually faded. The silence settled back in. I didn't sleep again. At dawn, I packed up quickly. My stomach was tight, food unappealing, so I forced down a protein bar and started walking. The forest looked different in the early light, colder somehow. Every tree seemed to hide something. I pushed hard that morning, faster than I usually went, wanting to cover ground. My legs burned, but I didn't care. By late morning, I was nearing the ridge. The trail opened into exposed rock, with steep drops on either side. The wind was stronger up there, whipping dust across my face. That was when I saw it. A piece of fabric caught on a branch near the trail. Dark green, frayed at the edges. It looked like it had been there a while, fluttering weakly in the wind. I stopped, staring. It wasn't mine. I hadn't seen anyone else, not since I started, but it was proof someone else had been here recently enough to leave something behind. I reached out and pulled it free. It was part of a sleeve ripped clean. My gut twisted. It didn't look like a careless bit of litter. It looked torn, like someone had left it unwillingly. I dropped it and kept moving, but now every step felt heavier. The ridge stretched on for miles, and by mid-afternoon I was exhausted. My canteen was running low, and I knew I had to find water soon. On the far side, the trail dipped again into forest. Shadows stretched long, and I realized I had misjudged the time. I needed to stop soon. I found another clearing, though smaller than the night before. I set up quickly, not wasting time. My nerves were frayed, and I kept glancing into the trees. That night was worse. I hadn't been lying down long before I heard movement again. Heavier this time, not circling, but coming closer. I held my breath, gripping the knife I kept by my sleeping bag. The steps paused just outside the tent. I could hear breathing, deep, human. Every hair on my body stood up. The breathing lingered, then slowly moved away. I didn't move until the first light broke through the trees. When I unzipped my tent, my stomach dropped. There were footprints in the dirt. Not boots, not shoes, bare feet, larger than mine, pressed deep into the soil around my tent, circling it. I packed up faster than I ever had in my life. My hands shook so badly I dropped my stove twice. I shoved everything into my bag, not caring if it was packed right, and started down the trail. I didn't stop for food, didn't stop for water. I just walked. Every step I expected to hear movement behind me, but the forest stayed silent. My mind kept replaying the sound of that breathing, slow and steady, right outside the thin nylon that had been the only thing between me and whoever it was. It took me nearly all day, but I finally reached the end of the trail. My legs were trembling from exhaustion, and my throat was raw from thirst. When I stumbled out onto the gravel pull-off, my truck was there. The other SUV was gone. I threw my pack in the bed, climbed inside, and locked the doors. My hands gripped the wheel, but I didn't start the engine right away. I just sat there, shaking, staring at the tree line. I never saw who it was. I never knew if they were following me, or waiting, or what they wanted. But I knew one thing for certain. Someone had been out there with me, moving at night, circling my camp, watching. I drove straight home and never went back to that trail. Even now, years later, I can still feel that silence pressing in, and I can still hear that breathing. That trip taught me something I never forgot. The scariest part of the wilderness isn't the animals or the weather. It's the people who choose to be out there in the dark with you, and the fact that you never really know what they're planning. My name is Daniel, and I was 26 when this happened. It was the summer of 2017 in late July, during one of the hottest stretches that year in Arizona. I had lived in Flagstaff for a couple of years, and I spent most of my free time outside. Hiking had become a kind of therapy for me. I worked long hours in a warehouse, lifting and moving boxes every day, and when I had free weekends, I tried to escape into the forests, deserts, or canyons around northern Arizona. That summer, I decided to push myself a little further. Instead of just doing short-day hikes on popular trails, I wanted to try longer, less used paths that would take me deeper into the wild. I had been reading guidebooks and looking at maps for weeks. One trail in particular caught my attention, a route that cut through a rugged gorge not far from Sedona. It wasn't in the tourist brochures, and only a couple of websites even mentioned it. The route was described as tough, with poor signage, steep climbs, and long dry stretches where there was no water at all. But the views, according to the few who had written about it, were incredible. I told myself it was the right time to try it. I was young, fit, and I wanted a challenge. The hike was supposed to take between 8 to 10 hours depending on speed and breaks. I had the weekend free, so I planned to leave early Saturday morning, hike through the gorge, and loop back by evening. I didn't think much of it at the time. I had done long hikes before, and though this one was less marked, I felt confident I could handle it. I left my apartment at 4 in the morning, driving south through the empty highways with a backpack loaded in the trunk. I had packed 3 liters of water in a hydration bladder, 2 extra bottles of water, energy bars, jerky, a bag of trail mix, a headlamp, a lighter, a small first aid kit, and a thin emergency blanket. My plan was to travel light but still cover the basics in case of delays. I figured I wouldn't need more than that since it was only supposed to be a day hike. By the time I reached the dirt parking pullout near the trailhead, the sun was barely starting to rise. The desert air was cool in the early hours, but I knew the heat would build quickly as the day went on. I locked the car, slung the pack over my shoulders, and started walking down a narrow, rocky path. First, everything felt perfect. The early morning light gave the red cliffs a golden glow. The desert plants, yucca, agave, small clusters of prickly pear, stood out in sharp contrast to the reddish soil. I walked at a steady pace, breathing in the dry air and enjoying the quiet. There was no one else around. It was exactly the kind of solitude I had been looking for. The first few miles were simple. The path descended gradually into a shallow canyon, winding between boulders and brush. I could hear insects buzzing, and every now and then a bird would dart across the open sky. My boots crunched against loose gravel, and my breathing stayed steady. I felt good, strong, and ready for the hours ahead. After about 2 hours, the canyon walls began to rise higher, and the ground became uneven. The sun was fully up by then, and I could already feel the heat pressing against the back of my neck. The trail was faint in places, just worn patches of dirt between rocks, and sometimes I had to stop and look around to spot cairns, small stacks of stones left by other hikers to mark the way. The gorge itself was beautiful but rough. Sheer cliffs towered above me, streaked with layers of red and orange rock. At the bottom, the ground twisted through dry washes and rocky ledges. Some sections required scrambling, using hands and feet to climb up short rises. I moved carefully, checking my footing each time, not wanting to slip and twist an ankle. By late morning, I had reached a wide bend in the gorge. The heat had become intense, bouncing off the rocks and baking the air until it felt like I was walking inside an oven. Sweat soaked my shirt and dripped down my face. I drank steadily from the hydration tube and rationed small sips from one of the bottles. I knew water was my biggest concern out here. The guide I had read mentioned a seasonal creek, but in July I doubted there would be much left. I kept going deeper. The gorge narrowed at points until the walls were only 20 feet apart, and the ground was covered with loose rock that slid under my boots. Every sound echoed: the clatter of a dislodged stone, the scrape of my backpack brushing a wall, even my own breathing. Around midday, I stopped in a shaded spot beneath an overhang to rest and eat. I pulled off the pack, sat on a flat rock, and chewed a piece of jerky while studying the map I had printed. The problem was the map wasn't detailed. It showed the general route of the gorge, but not the smaller turns or side canyons that branched off. I had assumed the cairns would make it clear. When I stood up and walked further on, I began to realize how easy it was to get turned around here. The gorge split in places with narrow side paths that looked almost the same as the main one. Some had cairns, but they were old and weathered. At one junction, I chose the wrong direction and ended up in a dead end after 15 minutes. I had to backtrack, burning energy and time in the blazing heat. That was the first flicker of unease I felt. It wasn't panic, but a quiet reminder that this wasn't a casual tourist trail. If I kept making mistakes, I could end up wandering in circles, wasting water. I shook it off and told myself to focus harder. By early afternoon, I had pushed deeper than I expected. My legs were beginning to feel heavy, and I noticed my pace slowing. The sun was high, and the heat was brutal, radiating from every surface. My water supply was already down by half, which was faster than I wanted. My mouth felt dry even after drinking, and salt lines had formed on my shirt from the sweat. I found what looked like the remains of the creek, just a sandy, cracked bed winding through the gorge. I crouched and checked for any sign of moisture, but it was bone dry. No chance of filling up there. I cursed myself silently for not bringing more bottles. I kept moving, but with more caution now. I scanned the walls for cairns, pausing often to compare the shape of the gorge with the vague line on the map. The silence was heavy, broken only by the occasional rustle of lizards darting between rocks. I began to feel the weight of isolation. There was no one else out here, and the thought settled in slowly, pressing at the back of my mind. Late in the afternoon, I reached a steep section where the gorge dropped sharply. The path descended over a series of ledges, and I had to lower myself carefully using my hands. The rock was hot to the touch, rough against my palms. At one point, I placed my foot on a slab that shifted under me. My boot slid, and I lost balance for a moment. My heart jumped as I grabbed at the wall, my pack pulling me sideways. I managed to steady myself, but my knee slammed against the rock as I fell onto it. Pain shot up my leg, sharp and deep. I sat down, breathing hard, and checked. The skin was scraped raw and bleeding, though not badly. The worst part was the throbbing pain that spread whenever I bent the knee. I wrapped it quickly with a bandage from the kit and sat there for a while, sweating and breathing in the still heat. The pain was manageable, but it slowed me down even more. Climbing after that became harder, each step sending a dull ache through my leg. By the time the sun started dropping lower, I realized I had miscalculated badly. I was nowhere near the end of the loop. The gorge stretched on ahead, twisting between shadows, and I couldn't even see the horizon. My water was nearly gone, with only one bottle left. I felt drained, lightheaded from the heat, and my injured knee made it harder to keep steady. I stopped, leaning against the wall, and tried to think clearly. I had two choices: keep pushing forward and hope I reached the end soon, or turn back the way I came. But the thought of climbing all the way back through everything I had already crossed seemed almost impossible with the time and energy I had left. I decided to push forward, telling myself the loop couldn't be much longer. The sun sank quickly, and the gorge fell into shadow. The heat lingered, trapped between the high walls, but the direct glare was gone. I switched on the headlamp as the light faded. The beam cut across rocks and brush, making shadows twist across the walls. I walked carefully, exhausted and thirsty. My throat burned, and every swallow felt dry. I tried to ration the last bottle, taking tiny sips, but the craving for more water gnawed at me constantly. The gorge grew darker, quieter. Insects chirped somewhere out of sight, and now and then I heard faint rustling in the brush, probably rodents or snakes. Each sound made me tense. My body ached from the long day, and the knee throbbed with every uneven step. I began to feel disoriented. The headlamp beam showed only a small circle of ground ahead, and the walls looked the same in every direction. At one split, I hesitated too long, unsure which way to go. I chose the left and followed it, but after 20 minutes, it narrowed into another dead end. My chest tightened as I realized I had wasted more time and energy. When I backtracked, the headlamp flickered, the battery draining faster than I expected. I switched it to a lower setting, but that made the path harder to see. My name is Daniel. I was 26 years old in the summer of 2017 when I decided to take a solo hiking trip in the northern part of Wyoming. I had always enjoyed being out in the woods, away from the constant noise of city life. My work at the time was draining, stuck in an office under fluorescent lights, staring at screens for hours with no real sense of purpose. Hiking, camping, and being outside gave me the reset button I needed. That summer, I had planned to hike a section of trail that wound through a range of mountains not far from the Montana border. It wasn't one of the famous national parks, which meant fewer tourists, but it was still rugged, vast, and remote. The whole stretch I planned to cover would take about 4 days, if the weather held and if I kept a steady pace. I packed carefully. My gear was standard but reliable. A 40-liter backpack, sleeping bag, compact tent, small stove, freeze-dried meals, water filter, map, compass, GPS, first aid kit, and a fixed blade knife. I carried about 3 liters of water to start, knowing I'd refill from streams along the way. I also had bear spray clipped to the strap of my pack, since I knew grizzlies were not uncommon in that part of the state. The trailhead was a gravel lot at the end of a dirt road, miles from the nearest small town. I parked my old Honda there, checked everything twice, and started walking early in the morning. The first day was beautiful. The trail was wide and well-worn at the beginning, cutting through lodgepole pine forests with sunlight spilling between the trees. The air smelled sharp and clean, with that resinous pine scent that always makes me feel more alive. My boots crunched over gravel and dry needles. I made good time, stopping only to drink water and take in views when the forest opened onto meadows. I saw elk tracks in the mud, fresh ones, and once caught sight of a mule deer bounding away into the brush. The silence between bird calls and wind felt heavy but pleasant, like the woods were absorbing everything, even my own footsteps. By evening, I had gone about 10 miles. I found a flat area near a creek to set up my tent. I cooked one of the freeze-dried meals, ate, and sat for a while listening to the water. As the sun dropped, the temperature fell quickly. I climbed into my sleeping bag, tired but content. That night, I woke once to the sound of something moving outside. My heart pounded as I listened. Heavy steps crunched in the leaves. Then they stopped. I held my breath. After a few seconds, I heard the faint splash of hooves in the creek. Probably elk again. I stayed still until the sounds moved farther away, then forced myself to relax. Sleep came in uneasy stretches after that. I woke before dawn, stiff but eager to move. The trail climbed higher into the hills that day. The forest grew denser, the path narrower, with roots and rocks slowing me down. I sweated under the rising sun, drank often, and checked my map at every junction. Around midday, I noticed I hadn't seen another person since the trailhead. Normally, I liked that solitude, but the stillness felt heavier than usual, like the forest was watching. I tried to shake the thought off, telling myself that was just part of being alone in big country. That evening, I set up camp on a slope above a marshy area. Mosquitoes swarmed the moment I stopped moving, so I lit a small smoky fire and huddled close to it while eating. I kept glancing at the tree line, uneasy without knowing why. When darkness fell, I crawled into the tent and zipped it up tight. Sleep didn't come easy. Every rustle outside made me tense. At one point, I thought I heard a faint snapping of branches uphill. Not close but not distant either. I held still, gripping the knife inside my sleeping bag. Nothing came of it. After what felt like hours, exhaustion pulled me under. The third day started fine. I packed up and followed the trail deeper into the range. The air grew cooler as clouds gathered overhead. By noon, a drizzle began, then steady rain. The trail became slick with mud. I pulled on my rain jacket, adjusted my pack cover, and pressed on. I slipped once, catching myself on a branch. My boots caked with mud, slowing me down. Progress was slower than I wanted, and the map told me I was still at least a day and a half from where the trail would loop back toward the trailhead. Late in the afternoon, the rain stopped, but fog rolled in. Thick white mist filled the trees. My world shrank to about 20 yards in every direction. Every shape in the fog looked strange, like it might move. I was tired, damp, and frustrated when I finally stopped to camp. I pitched the tent on the flattest patch I could find, though the ground was soft and spongy. As I boiled water for dinner, I realized how drained I felt. The woods were silent, too silent. No bird calls, no insect buzz, not even wind. Just the hiss of my stove. That night was when everything turned. I woke sometime past midnight. At first I thought it was thunder, but then I realized the sound was closer, sharper. Footsteps. Slow, deliberate footsteps outside my tent. Not animal steps. Not the 4-beat rhythm of a deer or elk. 2 feet. Human. They crunched softly in the wet leaves, stopping and starting. I froze, every muscle locked. My breath sounded too loud in the small tent. The steps circled once, then stopped near the back of my tent. Silence stretched so long I thought maybe I had imagined it. Then came the sound of fabric shifting, like fingers brushing against the tent wall. I grabbed the knife, hand trembling. My bear spray was at the entrance, just out of reach. The sound stopped. Minutes dragged by. My ears strained for anything, breathing, movement, another step. Nothing. Eventually, after what felt like hours, I convinced myself it had to be my mind playing tricks in the fog and dark. Maybe water dripping from the trees, maybe a branch shifting. I lay back down, though I never really slept again that night. When daylight came, I felt hollow. I packed quickly and set out, eager to put distance between myself and that campsite. The fog hadn't lifted much, making the trail harder to follow. At one point, the path split around a cluster of rocks. I chose the left fork, thinking it looked more traveled. After an hour, I realized I hadn't seen a trail marker in a long while. I checked the map and compass, but with the fog I wasn't certain of my bearings. I kept walking, hoping to reconnect with the main trail. Instead, the land sloped down into thicker forest, darker and wetter. My boots sank in mud. Branches clawed at my jacket. I finally admitted I was off trail. I tried to backtrack, but the fog had shifted everything. Nothing looked familiar. My footprints in the mud blurred and vanished. I forced myself not to panic, telling myself I could always set camp and wait until the fog lifted. By late afternoon, I still hadn't found the trail. My GPS beeped low battery, even though I charged it before the trip. That rattled me more than I wanted to admit. I found a small clearing and set up the tent. I was low on energy, so I ate only a granola bar and crawled inside. As the light faded, dread settled deep in my chest. Sometime deep in the night, I woke again. Not to silence this time, but to sound. A branch snapped nearby, then another. I held still, ears straining. The sound came closer, slow, steady steps. Again, 2 feet. Human. I gripped the knife so hard my hand hurt. The steps stopped just outside the tent. I heard breathing. Slow, measured, almost calm. Every hair on my body stood up. My chest tightened like it would burst. Then, just as before, silence. I didn't sleep again. I sat upright, knife in hand, until dawn bled weakly through the fog. In the morning, the fog thinned. I studied the map, checked the compass, and tried to set a course west toward where I knew the main trail had to be. I moved quickly, fueled by fear more than food. Around midday, I found something that made my stomach drop. Footprints. Human boot prints in the mud, not mine. They were larger, heavier, and fresh. They led roughly the same direction I was heading. For a moment, relief washed through me. Proof of another hiker, maybe someone I could follow to safety. But then the memory of those midnight footsteps returned, and the relief twisted into dread. Was it the same person? Had they been watching me, circling my tent? The footprints vanished into a patch of rocks and brush. I kept moving, nerves stretched thin. By late afternoon, I came across a small fire ring of stones with ashes still faintly warm. Someone had camped here recently. No tent, no pack, nothing left behind. Just the fire ring and a rough stick leaned upright in the ground. I didn't stop. I pushed past, walking until my legs shook, before setting camp on a ridge where I could see farther in every direction. That night, I didn't even try to sleep. I sat with my back against a tree, knife in one hand, bear spray in the other. Every sound in the dark made me twitch. My name is Daniel. I was 29 in the summer of 2016 when I decided to take a solo hiking trip through the northern part of Wyoming. I had been working long shifts in a warehouse for months, saving up money, and I wanted something that would take me far away from noise, traffic, and the feeling of being boxed in by city streets. I had been on day hikes before, sometimes with friends, sometimes with my cousin, but this was the first time I wanted to push myself into a longer route that included multiple days out in the wild, carrying everything I needed on my back. I planned a 3-day loop trail that wasn't particularly popular. I wanted solitude, not crowded paths. The trail was called the Forgotten Ridge Loop, a name that sounded more like a marketing thing than reality, though when I read about it on a few forums, people said it was rugged, lightly trafficked, and easy to lose your way if you weren't careful. That last detail should have made me hesitate, but I felt ready for it. I had a decent backpack, a sturdy tent, freeze-dried food, a water filter, a compass, a paper map, and even a GPS device I had borrowed from my uncle. I thought I had covered all my bases. I started the hike on a late July morning. The sky was bright, the air was warm but not oppressive, and the trail at the beginning wound through fields of tall grass and scattered pines. I parked my old gray Subaru in the dirt lot by the ranger station, signed my name on the trail registry sheet, and set off with my pack sitting snug on my shoulders. The first few miles were calm and peaceful. I passed through groves of aspen trees, their white bark catching sunlight, their leaves flickering and whispering with each breeze. I crossed 2 small streams, hopping across stones without needing to take my boots off. Birds darted overhead, and in the distance, the ridge itself rose against the horizon like a jagged spine. I felt excited, almost giddy. The whole point of this trip was to push away stress and test myself in the quiet spaces where only my footsteps and breathing filled the silence. As the trail climbed, the terrain grew rougher. The slope was steady but never brutal, though carrying 40 pounds on my back made me sweat through my shirt. I stopped often to sip water and check the map. I had drawn red circles on it before leaving, marking where I planned to camp each night. According to my plan, I would reach a flat meadow high up near the ridgeline by late afternoon and set up my tent there. The trail thinned out after about 6 hours. The dirt path faded into a mixture of rocks and scrub, and the markings became harder to spot. I had to pause at several points, scanning ahead for cairns. Small stacks of stones hikers had left to show the way. My legs burned, and the straps of my pack dug into my shoulders, but I kept pushing forward, telling myself the meadow was close. By evening, I finally reached the spot I had circled. It wasn't as flat as I had imagined, but it was good enough to pitch my tent. The ground had patches of grass and soil between slabs of stone. I set down my pack, unrolled the tent, and hammered stakes into the earth with the heel of my boot. The sun was lowering behind the mountains to the west, and shadows stretched across the ridge. The air turned cooler fast. I boiled water with my small camping stove, poured it into a bag of freeze-dried beef stew, and sat cross-legged while it cooked. Eating out there, with only the sound of wind brushing through the grass, felt peaceful. I cleaned up, packed my food away in a bear-resistant canister, and carried it 30 yards from camp, tucking it between rocks. Then I crawled into the tent as the last light faded. That first night wasn't restful. I dozed, but every small rustle outside pulled me awake. I heard the scurrying of small animals, the shifting of branches, and once the sharp crack of something stepping on a stick. My heart had raced at that sound, but it faded quickly. I reminded myself that deer, elk, and even bears could pass nearby without meaning any harm. I eventually drifted into a shallow sleep until morning light seeped through the thin walls of my tent. The second day was harder. The trail climbed even higher along the ridgeline, weaving between boulders and stunted pines. At several points, the path seemed to vanish altogether, and I had to check both my compass and GPS to be sure I was going the right way. I moved slower than I expected, my legs sore from the day before. The ridge wasn't kind. It rose and dipped like a saw blade, forcing me to descend steep slopes only to climb back up again. Clouds gathered around noon, turning the light gray. I felt uneasy when thunder rumbled in the distance. By late afternoon, a drizzle began. I pulled on my rain jacket, but the rocks grew slick, and my pace slowed even more. When I finally found a flat section near a cluster of trees, I decided to camp earlier than planned. I was frustrated at falling behind schedule, but it felt safer to stop than push forward on wet stone. That night, I slept worse. The rain tapped on the tent for hours, and a steady wind pushed against the fabric. At one point, I woke to the sound of something brushing against the outside wall of the tent. My breath caught, and I held still, listening. The sound came again, softer this time, like fur or cloth dragging lightly against the nylon. I reached for my flashlight, flicked it on, and shone it around inside, but the thin beam showed only the curve of the tent. I sat there for a long time, ears straining, before the noise stopped. In the morning, I stepped outside to find nothing unusual. No tracks, no claw marks, just wet grass and dripping branches. I convinced myself it was probably wind pushing a branch against the tent or a rabbit brushing past. Still, the unease clung to me. The third day was supposed to be my last. According to my plan, I would descend from the ridge and loop back toward the trailhead, reaching my car by evening. But things began to unravel before noon. The trail markings grew scarce, and several times I found myself standing in rocky clearings, spinning slowly, unsure of where to go. I checked the GPS, but the screen glitched. My position dot jumped back and forth, sometimes placing me off the map entirely. I pulled out my compass and paper map, but even then, the ridgeline around me looked different from what the map suggested. It was as if the terrain didn't match. Hours slipped by as I tried to push forward. My water supply dropped, and I stopped at a trickle of a stream to refill my bottle. I filtered the water and drank deeply, then pressed on. The sun was high, the heat pressing down, but I couldn't find the trail again. By late afternoon, I realized I was lost. Not just a little off the path lost, but truly lost. Every direction looked the same: jagged rocks, slopes of loose gravel, patches of stubborn trees. My stomach tightened with fear. I had a whistle, I had a map, I had a compass, but none of it seemed to matter if I couldn't orient myself. I told myself to stay calm. I remembered reading that panic makes everything worse. I picked a direction that should have led downhill, figuring it would eventually take me to a valley or a creek that might connect back to a trail. I started down, carefully testing each step. But the ridge was cruel. What looked like an easy slope turned into a dangerous descent. Gravel slid under my boots, and at one point I fell, scraping my forearm and bruising my hip. I sat on the rocks, breathing hard, fighting the urge to curse out loud. My arm stung, blood beading from the scrape, but it wasn't deep. I kept moving, slower now, trying to be cautious. The sun dipped lower, shadows growing long. My watch said it was past 7 when I realized I wouldn't find the trail before dark. I needed to set up camp, even if the ground was rough. I found a small clearing between two leaning boulders, cleared a patch of dirt, and pitched my tent there. That night was the worst yet. I had only one meal left, and I forced myself to eat half, saving the rest for the morning. The wind howled between the rocks, and the fabric of the tent snapped with each gust. I curled in my sleeping bag, exhausted but unable to relax. Around midnight, I heard movement again, this time sharper, like footsteps on stone. Slow, deliberate, my heart thumped in my chest. I held my breath, gripping the handle of my pocket knife inside my bag. The sound paused, then shifted closer. Pebbles clicked. I wanted to shout, to scare off whatever it was, but fear locked me still. Minutes dragged by until the noise faded into the distance. I lay awake for hours after, eyes wide in the dark, every nerve on edge. When dawn came, I felt hollow. My throat was dry, my body sore, and my mind clouded with fatigue. I forced myself to eat the last of my food, then packed up. My plan now was simple: move downhill until I found a river or road. Anything. The day dragged endlessly. I stumbled over uneven ground, my legs trembling with each step. My water ran low again, and I grew paranoid about finding another stream. My map felt useless. At one point, I climbed a tall rock to scan the horizon. All I saw were endless ridges and valleys, stretching far in every direction. No sign of a road, no hint of smoke, nothing human. By late afternoon, my name is Daniel Morgan, and I was 34 years old when this happened. It was the summer of 2012, and I had taken a week off work to get away from everything. I was working long hours in a warehouse in St. Louis, and the noise, heat, and stress were getting to me. I wanted something quiet, something natural, something that reminded me I wasn't just a cog in a machine. I decided on a solo hiking trip in the Ozark Mountains in southern Missouri. I had done day hikes before, sometimes with friends, but this was the first time I wanted to push myself to do a multi-day hike alone. I figured I would learn something about myself. I thought it would be peaceful, almost like therapy. I bought a detailed topographic map, a new backpack, a good pair of boots, and some supplies. I planned to hike a long loop trail that was a little over 40 miles, spread across thick forests, rocky ridges, and winding valleys. I told myself I could finish it in about 4 days if I paced myself right. The trail wasn't very popular, which I liked. I didn't want crowded paths. I wanted silence, space, and the feeling of being far from the world. On the morning of July 10th, I parked my car at the small gravel lot near the trailhead. There were only 2 other cars there, both older models, maybe belonging to people camping deeper in the forest. I signed the trail registry at the little wooden kiosk, noting my route and expected return. The air was hot and humid, even though it was early morning. The cicadas buzzed so loud it almost drowned out everything else. I should have paid more attention to how heavy my pack was. I had stuffed it with too much food, extra clothes, and gear I thought I might need but probably didn't. It dug into my shoulders right away, and within the first mile I was already sweating through my shirt. But I told myself it was fine. I just needed to get used to the weight. The trail started out smooth, wide enough to follow without effort. I moved past oak and hickory trees, the air filled with the sweet smell of summer leaves baking in the heat. Birds chirped, squirrels darted across fallen logs, and here and there I saw deer tracks pressed into the dirt. I kept sipping water from my hydration pack, telling myself to pace it out. By noon, the heat was brutal. I stopped near a small creek to refill my bottles, filtering the water carefully, then sitting on a rock while I ate a protein bar and let my shirt dry out a little. The woods were quiet except for insects, the kind of quiet that feels heavy, like you're deep inside something alive. I hiked until late afternoon, covering maybe 10 miles. My legs felt sore already, but it was a good kind of soreness. I set up camp in a small clearing not far from the trail. I pitched my tent, cooked some instant noodles on my little camp stove, and stretched out on my sleeping pad. The air cooled slightly, and as the light faded, fireflies blinked in the trees. That first night was peaceful. I fell asleep listening to crickets and the distant sound of frogs near water. The second day started harder. My shoulders ached from the pack. My feet had blisters forming even though I had good boots on. The trail narrowed, became steeper, and the rocks underfoot made it slow going. I had to climb sections with both hands, and every time I looked back I could see the valley falling away, the trees stretching endless in every direction. Around noon I noticed something strange. A boot print in the dirt ahead of me. It wasn't fresh, maybe a day or 2 old, but it was clear. I wasn't surprised, other hikers used the trail, but it stuck in my head. Later I saw another, and another, some of them overlapping, all heading the same way I was going. By late afternoon, I was exhausted. I had planned to stop earlier, but the ground everywhere I looked was sloped or overgrown, and I kept telling myself to go a little farther to find a better campsite. When I finally did, it was already getting dark. That night I didn't sleep as well. The forest seemed louder. I kept hearing noises, branches cracking, something moving in the brush. Could have been deer or raccoons, I told myself. Still, I woke up several times, heart pounding, listening to the dark. On the morning of the 3rd day, I felt uneasy. I couldn't shake the thought that someone else was out there, maybe not far ahead. The boot prints looked fresher now, pressed into damp soil. At one point, I even saw a spot where it looked like someone had sat down on a log, leaving marks where the ground was disturbed. By afternoon, I started rationing my water more carefully. The creeks were smaller, some of them dried up. The sun was baking everything, and the heat made me dizzy. I forced myself to keep moving. I came across a strange sight that evening. Off to the side of the trail, half hidden in brush, was a small fire pit. Old cold ashes, a ring of rocks, and next to it, a piece of rope and an empty can of beans. It looked recent, maybe within the past week. I crouched down, staring at it, and felt that uneasy pressure in my chest again. Someone had been here, maybe still was. I didn't camp near that spot. I pushed another mile down the trail and set up my tent in a hollow between some trees. That night was worse than the last. I barely slept at all. I kept hearing footsteps, soft, irregular, like someone moving slowly through leaves. My skin prickled every time. At one point, I thought I heard breathing just outside my tent. I gripped my knife inside my sleeping bag, my heart racing so loud it felt like it would give me away. I never saw anyone, though. When dawn finally came, I felt sick from lack of sleep. My legs were stiff, my throat dry, and I wanted nothing more than to be out of those woods. According to my map, I had about 12 miles left. I told myself I could do it in one push if I just kept going. The trail got rougher. Steep climbs, narrow ledges, loose rocks. My legs shook every time I had to pull myself up. I slipped more than once, skinning my palms and knees. The sun was high, the heat unbearable, and my water was running low again. At some point that afternoon, I knew I was being followed. I didn't see anyone, but I heard it. Branches snapping, footsteps keeping pace with mine. Not close, not too far, but steady. Every time I stopped, the sound stopped. When I moved again, it picked up. I tried to speed up, my heart racing, sweat stinging my eyes. My pack felt twice as heavy. I thought about dropping it, but I needed the map, the water, the little bit of food I had left. By late afternoon, I was stumbling. My legs felt like lead. My throat was dry, and I hadn't seen a good water source for hours. I pushed through thick brush, scraping my arms, and when I looked back, I thought I saw movement. Just a flicker of something, a shape in the trees. That's when panic took over. I left the trail, crashing downhill, branches whipping my face. I didn't care where I was going. I just wanted to put distance between myself and whatever was back there. But leaving the trail was the worst mistake. The ground turned uneven, rocky, full of holes and hidden roots. I slipped, slid, and finally my foot twisted hard under me. Pain shot up my leg, and I went down hard, hitting my shoulder against a rock. I lay there gasping, dirt in my mouth, pain throbbing in my ankle. I tried to stand, but my right foot gave out. Sprained at least, maybe worse. I sat there, shaking, realizing I couldn't hike out easily now. As the light faded, I dragged myself to a small flat spot between rocks and trees. I didn't have the strength to set up my tent. I just pulled my sleeping bag around me, clutching my knife, staring into the dark. That night was the longest of my life. I heard movement again, closer than ever, footsteps circling. At one point, I thought I saw a shadow just beyond the trees, standing still, watching. My breath came in shallow gasps. I didn't move. I didn't sleep. When the first light came, I forced myself up, hobbling on my injured ankle, leaning on a stick as a crutch. I didn't care about the map anymore. I just went downhill, figuring I'd hit a road or a river eventually. I stumbled, fell, dragged myself along mile after mile. By mid-afternoon, dehydrated, half delirious, I broke through the trees and saw a dirt road. Relief hit me so hard I nearly collapsed. I followed it, limping, until I heard the sound of an engine. A pickup truck came into view, and I staggered into the road, waving my arms. The driver, a farmer hauling hay, stopped and stared at me like I was a ghost. He helped me into the truck, gave me water, and drove me straight to the nearest town. From there, I made it back home, foot swollen, body covered in cuts and bruises, mind still reeling. I never found out who was out there. Maybe it was just another hiker, maybe a hunter, maybe someone living rough in the woods. All I know is they followed me, watched me, and never showed themselves. It's been years now, but I still wake up at night, hearing those footsteps in my head. I still feel that pressure of being hunted, the way the forest closed in around me. I haven't gone hiking alone since. My name is Daniel Miller. I was 29 years old in the summer of 2014 when I decided to take a solo hiking trip in the Bitterroot Mountains of western Montana. At that point in my life, I felt restless. I had been working long hours at a warehouse job in Spokane, Washington, and I wanted something that could pull me away from the constant grind of concrete floors and heavy machinery. Hiking had always been my escape. I was not an expert outdoorsman, but I had taken several multi-day backpacking trips, mostly along easier trails. That summer, I wanted something harder. I spent weeks looking over maps and trip reports. The Bitterroots drew me in. The range stretched along the border of Montana and Idaho, rugged and wild, filled with steep ridges, alpine lakes, and dense forests that could swallow a person whole. Most people stuck to the main trails, but I noticed a loop that cut through lesser-used paths, a 60-mile circuit that could be done in about 6 days. It was remote, it had elevation gain that would test me, and most importantly, it promised solitude. By mid-July, I had my gear packed. I wasn't new to hiking alone, and I liked the silence of it. No schedules, no one's pace but mine. I had a tent, sleeping bag, stove, food, and a GPS device. I carried a paper map and compass too. I told myself I was prepared. Looking back now, I realize I was too confident. I drove out from Spokane early in the morning, crossed into Montana, and reached the trailhead around noon. The small dirt parking lot was empty. A weathered signboard listed bare safety tips and trail closures, though none applied to my route. I slung my pack over my shoulders and started. The first day was almost perfect. The trail wound through forest that smelled of pine and damp earth. My pack dug into my shoulders, but I welcomed the weight. I felt strong. I followed switchbacks that climbed steadily higher, with occasional breaks in the trees that gave me views of rocky ridges in the distance. I reached a small lake by evening, set up my tent on a flat patch of ground, cooked instant noodles, and watched the sun fade into streaks of pink. It was exactly the kind of peace I wanted. The second day pushed me higher into the range. I climbed for hours, sweating through my shirt, stopping only to catch my breath or refill water from streams. I saw no one. The air grew cooler as I gained elevation. I crossed talus slopes where rocks shifted under my boots, then dropped into valleys filled with thick forest. That night, I camped beside another lake, larger this time, its surface still and glassy under the moonlight. By the third day, the trail grew rougher. The tread narrowed, sometimes disappearing under fallen trees or overgrown brush. My pace slowed. Around midday, I slipped on a steep descent, caught myself on a tree trunk, and felt a sharp pull in my right ankle. It wasn't broken, but pain shot through it with each step. I told myself I could manage. I tightened my boot and kept going. That decision would haunt me later. I planned to finish the loop in 6 days, but by the 4th day, I was behind schedule. The ankle slowed me down more than I admitted at first. Every downhill stretch was torture. I camped near a meadow that night, my ankle throbbing. I sat with my map spread on my knees, tracing the trail ahead with my finger. If I cut across a connecting path, I could shorten the loop by nearly 20 miles. It wasn't the route I planned, but it would get me back to the trailhead faster. The next morning, I reached the junction where the shortcut branched off. The sign was old, the lettering barely legible, but the arrow pointed west toward the ridge I needed to cross. I hesitated. The trail looked narrow and faint, as if few people used it, but I told myself it was fine. I stepped onto it and began climbing. At first, the trail was clear enough, though it was steep and rocky, but after a few hours, it became harder to follow. Brush grew thick, and fallen logs forced me to detour. The ankle slowed me further. Around mid-afternoon, clouds gathered. A storm rolled in quickly, the way they do in the mountains. Thunder echoed off the ridges, and rain poured down, soaking me in minutes. The trail vanished under slick mud and wet leaves. I tried to keep moving, but soon I couldn't tell where the path was. My GPS, which had worked fine until then, refused to lock onto a signal under the heavy clouds. I pulled out my map and compass, trying to steady my nerves. I knew the general direction I needed to go, west over the ridge, but the forest around me looked the same in every direction. I pushed on, choosing what I thought was the right line of travel. The rain didn't stop until late evening, and by then I was exhausted. My ankle throbbed, my clothes clung to my skin, and the temperature had dropped sharply. I found a small clearing barely large enough for my tent and set it up with numb fingers. I crawled inside, shivering, and ate a cold energy bar. I tried not to think about how far off trail I might be. The next morning, I realized just how bad it was. I packed up and tried to find the trail again, circling through the trees. Every direction looked wrong. There were no footprints, no cut logs, no blazes, just endless forest. My map helped a little, but without a clear landmark, it was guesswork. The ridge I thought I needed to cross loomed above me, steep and rocky. I started climbing anyway. Took most of the day to scramble up. My ankle screamed with every step, but I forced myself higher, grabbing at rocks and roots. By late afternoon, I reached the top. The view should have been reassuring. Mountain ridges rolling out in every direction, valleys thick with trees, but instead it filled me with dread. I couldn't tell where I was. Nothing matched the map. I descended the other side slowly, my legs shaky. Near dusk, I stumbled across a faint animal trail and followed it until I found a small stream. I camped there, hoping I could use the water to orient myself. By the 6th day, I knew I was lost. My food was running low. I had packed enough for 6 days with maybe one extra, but moving slower had eaten through my supplies. I tried rationing, but hunger gnawed at me constantly. I filtered water from streams, but the lack of calories left me weak. The forest seemed to close in tighter each day. I moved west whenever I could, thinking eventually I'd hit a road or a main trail, but the terrain forced me in circles. Steep ridges, thick brush, deadfall that slowed me to a crawl. My ankle swelled until my boot felt like a vice. At night, I lay in my tent listening to the distant howls of coyotes, the crack of branches, the silence that pressed down like a weight. By the 8th day, I stopped using the tent. I didn't have the energy to set it up anymore. I slept under trees, curled in my sleeping bag, waking often from the cold. My food was nearly gone. I ate the last of my trail mix that morning and chewed pine needles in desperation. My mind began to play tricks. I thought I saw shapes moving between the trees, but when I blinked, they were gone. I thought I heard voices carried on the wind, but it was only the creak of branches. The hunger and exhaustion blurred everything together. On the 10th day, I reached another ridge. I forced myself to climb it, each step agony. When I reached the top, I saw something that jolted me awake. In the valley below, a straight line cut through the trees. A road. It was far, maybe 2 miles, but I felt a surge of hope. I stumbled downhill, half sliding, half falling. My legs gave out several times, but I got back up, driven by the thought of escape. As I neared the bottom, the ground leveled out into swampy terrain. I slogged through mud, mosquitoes swarming my face, until at last I stepped onto gravel. The road was narrow, more like a logging road than a highway, but it was real. I collapsed onto it, gasping. Relief washed over me, but it was short-lived. The road was empty. I had no idea which direction would lead to help. I chose south, following it as best I could. My legs shook with every step, but the thought of staying alive pulled me forward. That evening, I saw a shape in the distance, wooden posts, wire fencing. Then a small cabin, its roof sagging but smoke curling from a chimney. I almost cried. I staggered to the cabin and knocked weakly on the door. The man who opened it looked startled, but he quickly pulled me inside. I sank into a chair, barely able to speak. He gave me water, then bread, then soup. I ate until my stomach cramped. The man had a radio and contacted search and rescue. They arrived the next morning, checked my ankle, and loaded me into a truck. I learned later I had been nearly 15 miles off course, deep in an area with no maintained trails. If I hadn't found that road, I might not have made it out. Took weeks to recover. My ankle wasn't broken, but the sprain was severe. I lost nearly 20 pounds from the ordeal. For months after, I woke in the night with the taste of pine needles still in my mouth, the sound of distant thunder echoing in my head. That trip taught me something I'll never forget. The wilderness doesn't care how confident you feel, how prepared you think you are. One wrong turn, one bad